Hello, my name is Frank Kudis. I'm from Nite Calgary. Joining me today is Joy Windsor, also a co-boss from Nite Calgary and from the University of Calgary. And joining us today is David Peterson. He is the creator of the languages from Game of Thrones, along with many other movies and TV shows. And we're going to be talking today about language creation. What is language creation?
Well, language creation is the intentional creation of a new language by one or more people. So all the languages that we speak on Earth, be they spoken, signed, or otherwise, they were all created by humans, but they were created unconsciously, just by people trying to communicate with one another by whatever means they have. They, somebody could try to invent new words here or there, but whether they catch on or not is kind of more of a matter of happenstance. Whereas with a created language, that means one or more people actually sat down and said, we're going to create a new language, we're going to create the entire grammar, we're going to create all the words, and we're going to create it from moment one. And so that makes them a little bit different from natural languages that exist on Earth.
The languages that you have created, let's just start with, what was the first language you created, and what was your process for creating that language?
The very first language that I created was a very, very poor quality language. Created it in the year 2000 in my third semester at UC Berkeley as a sophomore. And the language that I created, I had the idea that if I created a language just for myself, just for fun, that would license its existence, as opposed to being something that was going to try to compete with Esperanto that could never compete with Esperanto. If it was just going to be for my purposes, then I could create it, and so I started. Like many people creating their very first language, I had no idea what on earth I was doing, and so I made a lot of decisions in this language that didn't necessarily hold together very well. So I wanted it to sound really cool, but I also wanted it to have every single sound I was learning about in my linguistics courses. I wanted it to be easy to learn, and I wanted it to be really unique and irregular in certain parts. I wanted it to have, I wanted to be able to use it in my real life right then. I also wanted to have some sort of a weird fictional backstory having to do with knights and stuff. So it were completely incongruous goals, and the result was an absolute disaster. And the process, I mean, I didn't have one. I didn't have one at the time. I didn't know what I was doing, and so the result was just absolutely unworthy of comment.
Yeah. Unworthy of comment.
I think that's really common. Like most of us do the exact same thing. I remember making a lot of language sketches when I was a kid, and they all basically turned into Irish or Latin or German. And then the first time I sat down to actually make a conlang, very consciously, I'm going to create a grammar, I'm going to create a phonology and all this stuff. I wanted clicks, I wanted ejectives, I wanted implosives, and then I decided vowels were going to not only have different vowels, but also nasal vowels, oral vowels, breathy vowels, and then the copula, kind of like the verb to be, ended up being oh. Yeah, and so I don't speak about that language very often. I've permanent shelved that one. Wow. And I've gotten better since, I hope.
So when you're creating a language, do you start with an overall idea of I want it to have something special grammatically, or I want it to sound a certain way, or I want it to have a certain function? Like what? Or is it a variety of different kind of original ideas for how you start the creation process?
Well, for myself, there's usually something I want to try out, whether it's a phonological pattern or whether it's a morphological pattern, but it's usually one of those two for me. So what that means is, say I wanted to do a language and I wanted to do initial consonant mutation, the type of thing that you see in the Celtic languages, but I wanted it to have a unique evolution to get something that's a little bit different. And I wanted to be motivated. I wanted it to be morphologically motivated, meaning that it would be used in some way in the language. I mean, it's silly to create something and then it's never used. Mm-hmm. If you're gonna put the cannon on stage, you got to fire it by the second act, So usually it starts off like that, or I come up with an idea, something like, what if I went further with noun classifiers so that they kind of straddle the boundary between noun classes and classifiers. How might that work? And so then I start from there. And I kind of build the language around it with the idea of trying to test out this one thing. And, create the evolution behind it to support that feature. So there's an idea there, but it's not necessarily a whole, crystallized idea. I don't know. You do things differently?
So a lot of my conlangs are very specifically for like Dungeons and Dragons games or something like that. So I'm fortunate that I have the creatures or the humanoids or the race that are going to speak my language. I know something about them, which can kind of guide my thought process. So if I'm creating a language for a race that doesn't have lips, I'm not going to have any labial sounds like pa and ba and things like that. So I'll start with the phonology almost every time, and then because I'm a theoretical linguist, I will sketch out exactly what the theoretical grammar would look like and let that guide a lot of my decisions. And then, of course, play with it and try and come up with some cool things. But yeah, it really revolves around who's going to be speaking it, or what fictional race is going to be speaking it.
Now, when you've dealt with these languages that you've had some sort of starting with for Game of Thrones, what have you taken from the books and morphed into, or I guess used into how you've started?
The goal when you're creating something like the languages for George R. R. Martin's books is to take everything that you're given and to be sure that you use it, so that it's not going to be the case where you say, well, the Dothraki that's in the book isn't quite right because of this, and this thing I did. That wouldn't work, mainly because, the whole point was to make this version of George R. R. Martin's world. And so if you did something that was radically different, it might be, interesting in an abstract sense, but it wouldn't be faithful to the original. So the first thing that I did was gather up everything that he had done, and I analyzed it to see what consistency there was, if there was any. I was expecting to not find consistency, but I did, actually, so that was nice. Everything that he did was very consistent, both in terms of its phonological character, its sound, and in terms of its grammar. And so that was wonderful. The next question was, is it just copying English? And that was also a nice surprise. It wasn't just copying English. Beyond that, was it super interesting with respect to, is it something that you wouldn't expect somebody who had kind of basic familiarity maybe with French, Spanish, German to create? It wasn't that, but it was still consistent in non-English, so that was cool. So I got all that together, and then I fleshed out from there, making sure that everything that I did supported the original creation.
Now, when you say it's not English, what are you referencing, grabbing from English and moving into?
I want to give you a quick example. In English, if you want to say there's a boy and he's strong, you say that's the strong boy. There's a phrase or a line from the books of George R. R. Martin's where you have a line of Dothraki and it's translated in the books. And the line is rach, hajj. And it's translated as a boy, a strong boy. So analyzing that in the most charitable way possible, or at least in the simplest way possible, based on the repetition, based on the translation, the word for boy has to be rach, and the word for strong has to be hajj. And so what you have then is the modifier coming after the noun, which is the exact opposite of what happens in English. Okay. I mean, there's really only two options there, so you could kind of flip a coin, right? And so one's going to be like one language, one's going to be like another, but it's like he could have done something that was exactly like English and he didn't. And then, of course, the question after that was, okay, well, that's that phrase. Does it stick for everything else? And it did. The modifiers consistently come after their heads, or after the nouns that they modify, throughout all of the extant material in his books. And so, in that way, Dothraki was both consistent and not just directly copying English. So that was cool.
Now, this is going to jump ahead to a question I was going to ask later, but do you have people come back to your translations that come out in the TV shows and critique your translation or your the method that you've used or the grammar that you've created?
Yeah. I mean, the greatest fiction that I think a lot of people believe, including the creators of the shows themselves. So like, David Benioff and Dan Weiss, they even mentioned this like recently in an interview they did about season 8. They believe that nobody on Earth knows what's going on with these languages except for me. That's just not true. That's really not understanding fandom. I mean, and it's not a phenomenon with my language by any means. In Star Trek The Next Generation, after the first season, all of the Klingon is absolute garbage because basically that's when Mark Okrand stopped doing translations for them for free and asked to please be paid for his work. And so that's when they stopped talking to him. And so from season 2 on, Star Trek The Next Generation, he had published this Klingon Dictionary, right? Yeah. They just used that. And they just grabbed words out of the dictionary, they threw them in English order, grammar be damned, and like don't even bother to check if like the word that's translated as this in English is actually a homonym, like you know what I'm saying, like a bank type of thing. They're like, whatever, that's the word for bank, let's put that in, that type of a thing. And so it became apparently kind of a fun game in the early days of the internet for fans of Klingon to look at these episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation and the very day of or the next day analyze the Klingon that was in there and try to figure out what the writers thought they were doing. But that was like back then.
Yeah.
Compare those days of the internet to now.
Instantaneous feedback.
Instantaneous. By the end of season 1, people were figuring things out about Dothraki and analyzing. I mean, by season 3, forget it. They just knew. And so by now, and it's not like it's just one fan somewhere. It's everywhere. Like, there was an error in episode 1 of this season, and I found out about it on Twitter less than 24 hours later. There was an error in the Dothraki. It switched the subtitles without having me change the translation. And then there was an error in the 3rd episode with High Valyrian. I didn't even catch it on the first airing. Found out about that from an entirely different person. That said, I don't think it was Carice Van Houten playing Melisandre. He says, I don't think that she pronounced one of those words right based on the translation that you gave. And I looked and I was like, oh, sure enough, she did not.
Now, do you publish your work on this? Like, how are people just picking it up?
In the broad sense, I suppose. But I mean, first, if you hear it, then it's there. I mean, that is a language. If you hear it, then it's there. So anybody can analyze it. Okay. I'll post the translations a day later. Sometime after the airing, after it's been public. But these types of things are discovered before I put those up. I mean, it's near instantaneous.
Yeah. How far back does created languages go?
So, Hildegard von Bingen, if I'm remembering the name correctly, was a 12th century abbess who received dreams or visions, supposedly divinely inspired. And this is the earliest recorded conlang that we know of. So about 800 years for that one. And it turns out that was just mostly a bunch of nouns and a few adjectives, so she would have ways to describe things. But I don't think there was, or at least we don't know, that there was a full grammar of the language that you could actually do translations, but she would have these divinely inspired words and ways of writing things that seem to be quite Latinate, I think.
Yeah, very Latinate. I will say this, though. So all of the words are nouns that we have evidence of. Yeah. But you see evidence of compounding.
Yes.
So, and because of that,
sort of structure.
there is grammar in there,
Yeah.
not to the extent that we know today.
Yeah.
But, so that goes back, the late 1100s. And what year is this?
2019 now? Yeah.
So it's like, 800 or so years, almost 1,000 years. And the thing is, that's the first recorded instance we have. You can be pretty confident that at least inventiveness with language goes back as far as language does. And I'm sure there are people that created languages before. We just don't have records of it because, you have to deal with written records. So That's like the earliest. Going forward, there were different phases of language creation, the types of languages you saw. So first came the, in addition to other religious languages like Bala Balan, there were the philosophical languages that tried to perfect language. In other words, they saw language was, very imprecise, and so they thought for science, we're going to create a perfect language so that everything is always exactly as it should be. They weren't super great at that, but
These are people like Isaac Newton doing this.
Leibniz.
Yeah.
Right.
So like, we're in good company here.
Yeah. After that came the auxiliary, the international auxiliary language phase, where there were many language creators who thought that if everybody shared the same language, there would be peace. And so they tried to create simplified, universal languages that would be able to unite all peoples and everybody could learn. And so, the examples you see, say, they have, these universal languages that, spread all the way from, London to Paris and encompass everything in between. So they're not really super universal, but they are.
London to Paris at the universities all the way.
Yeah, they're marginally easier to learn than, say, a natural language like French or Spanish. But there was a big boom of that in the late 19th century, going on into the early 20th century. And then after that, kind of the modern era of artistic language creation, or just language creation for enjoyment, we kind of date it to Tolkien, because he's the first one that we really have records of. That is somebody who created languages just for the love of it. Certainly there were others. Certainly there were others before him.
So he was famous just because of the timing of recorded.
Yeah, well, he was famous because he wrote those books.
Yeah,
if he hadn't gone on to write those books, there's a good chance we probably wouldn't know about his languages. Unless I don't know, his children were particularly interested and wanted to share them with the world, and somebody cared or somebody found out.
Yeah.
But the books became super popular. He used them as a vehicle for his his languages, and so then people found out about it. And that, I think, was it was kind of a nice announcement, or a way to license the activity for others who already were doing it or who might be interested. And that kind of birthed the modern movement of language creation, where people are really just doing it because they enjoy doing it.
So who is asking for languages to be created?
So with the Language Creation Society, actually David started this. We have a jobs board, so people can email us and ask us to put up a bulletin to hire a conlanger. We get a lot of novelists want languages for their novels. Some people who are making video games want languages to be spoken in the background of the video games. Small films will come to us. Typically the big films don't, except for Game of Thrones, don't come through us. But I mean, you can talk to that end of the spectrum.
Yeah. I will mention this because I want to mention this because I'm just thinking about it. The people that are coming to the jobs boards that are novelists, most of them are amateur novelists.
Yeah.
Most of them, it's like, I have an idea for a fantasy novel that I hope will be published one day. And they're actually paying language creators to create those languages. The big name novelists, no. They're like, oh, I don't have the kind of money to spend on that. Excuse me, you do. Like, these are people who've never had anything published. These are people that it's not like, oh, I'm this famous novelist on the side, but I still have my day job. No, they only have their day job. They're not getting paid to write. Nobody is publishing their stuff, and yet they're paying people to create languages. And the big name novelists are not. It's a joke to me.
Yeah. I did a language for Chad Queen. He published the first book in what's hopefully a series, The Phantom Pact. And he paid me to invent the language for this, and an augmented reality video game that he was trying to do on the side. And I'm pretty sure it's on Amazon eBooks for free right now. So I don't even know that he's making back the money that he paid me to make this language.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's just, it annoys me because I know novelists now. I know novelists are like, oh, I don't want to. It burns me. You see, famous novelists, even outside of fiction. This is one that Jesse Sams, who teaches conlang class at Stephen F. Austin, pointed out to me. Alice Hoffman, who was a famous novelist, invented a language for one of her books. It's just complete gibberish. And it's the type of thing where you see this a lot with novelists. They will accept the praise when people like what they've done. But if people criticize, you know, these invented languages there, they say, well, I'm no Tolkien. Like, you can't have it both ways. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So anyway, but yeah, of course. So now movie studios, television studios, and video games, slowly but surely, they're the last adopters. You know, they're trying to hire people to create languages, and that's really, really cool. There are certainly more opportunities than ever. There are still opportunities that are slipping by the wayside, opportunities that should have been. Things like, and I keep mentioning them because I'm just so mad at them, but like things like the DreamWorks Voltron and DreamWorks She-Ra. Both of them have languages, kind of, where it's really just one or two words here and there and like a writing system here and there. It's like, that could have been somebody's dream job, and you just kind of did it. And again, they will accept the praise. But if you criticize, like, oh, well, it's just, you know, something we did. It's no big deal. It's no Dothraki. It's like, yeah, we know. Anyway.
So the Language Creation Society, what did you start it for?
Well,
what was its goal?
Well, this way back when, the Language Creation Society was the brainchild of a fellow named Syfy. And he had, his initial idea was for something called the Language Creation Conference. It was held at UC Berkeley in 2006. And the whole point was that to have a conference dedicated not to some specific language, like Esperanto or auxiliary languages in general, and not like a fan convention for people who've learned a language, like Klingon, but for language creators themselves to kind of get together and discuss their work, discuss what they did, learn from each other, and meet each other face to face, which is something that language creators generally didn't do. Because, you know, we have the internet, that's the only way we knew each other. We're generally not all in the same place. So he went about setting up this language creation conference in 2006. Many of us attended it. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun meeting people in real life that we'd only known online. And then they wanted to do it again the next year. Same place, 2007 at UC Berkeley, but in between that time, Syfy had graduated. And so, you know, just for technical reasons, it's a lot easier to do things like get university space if you're a student versus if you're not, even if you're a recent graduate. Syfy came up with this idea: if we had a nonprofit organization, then we could get funding for the Language Creation Conference. Something that is indeed very technically true, but just doesn't happen. But I mean, technically true. Anyway, so Syfy collected 10 people to be the original board of the Language Creation Society. I was among them. Many of us were language creators, some weren't. But we got together right before the second Language Creation Conference and founded the Language Creation Society. In fact, the three people who were on hand were me, Syfy, and John Clifford, three of the original board members. And so we founded the Language Creation Society with the main reason being to fund the Language Creation Conference. But then kind of, you know, as an ancillary thing, we started saying like, well, we could also promote language creation, you know, serve as a resource for anybody outside the community that wants to know what it's for. And then, yeah, in 2009, literally out of the blue, the Language Creation Society was contacted by Dan Weiss and David Benioff to create the Dothraki language. It was just something that we were not prepared for at all.
Yeah, it's a really good vehicle now, because I probably get at least 3 or 4 emails a week from students somewhere in the world saying, hey, I'm doing this paper, and they said we need to interview someone. I want to talk about constructed languages. Can we interview you about constructed languages? And it's just email correspondence, but
Fantastic.
They find us through the website. And yeah, it's great to be able to advocate. I got a question 2 nights ago. Why do we bother constructing languages? We could devote so many more resources to understanding what language is and unlocking the secrets of actual language. And I said, you know, there are values scientifically for constructed languages, but for a lot of people it's an art form, and you don't say, well, we've got enough songs now, it's time to stop composing, right?
We've had Sultans of Swing, so we're done.
Then we wouldn't get songs in Valyrian, you know.
When's your first album coming out?
Someday, don't worry.
Wasn't there just like Muse did a song that had some Valyrian in it?
Yeah, I was so flabbergasted that they just insulted that they didn't contact me. But I guess they just used recordings from the show, so they didn't actually sing the Valyrian.
Okay.
That's fine. Someday we'll get there. We'll get there.
When you are creating a language, do you pull from other languages? Do you pull words from other languages, or?
It depends. Well, let me just jump on that question, add it on. It depends, basically, if you're doing it or if you're not. There's a big division amongst all created languages between two types, a posteriori and a priori. An a priori language, you are essentially creating all of the grammar and all of the words by yourself, and you're just creating them brand new. With an a posteriori language, though, it's the exact opposite, where you actually are using natural language resources, or in some cases other resources, for some particular purpose. And so you might ask why for each one, and it really depends language by language. For example, one of the more famous a posteriori languages in the community is a language called Brythonic. And Andrew Smith, what he did is he said, what if the Romans came and conquered Britain for a short time? Yeah. What if they left Romans there and the Latin language actually survived on the British Isles? What might it have looked like had they, mixed with the Celtic speakers, and you saw basically pronunciation changes, very similar to Celtic, in the Latin language. And so what he did is he produced a language that is a Romance language, like French or Spanish or Portuguese or Italian, with Celtic sound changes. And so if you just listen to like the sound of it, or even look at the way he's written it with the Roman alphabet, because would be, it looks and it sounds like a Celtic language. But if you actually look at the grammar and look at where are all these words coming from, it is exactly a Romance language. And so that just makes it's a really fun, kind of interesting experiment and a really excellent demonstration of that type of thing. So like language that I've done is for the 100, I created what would have happened to people on the ground after society was destroyed in America, right? What if they kept on speaking English? What might it look like 150 years from now? And so I created that, where it's like, well, no, you're not going to create a brand new language, right? All of it, it's going to have its roots in modern English. And it doesn't necessarily need to come from natural languages either. David Bell was really, really fascinated by Tolkien's languages, but his languages are notoriously incomplete. And so he created his own Tolkienate or Quenya language, using the roots that Tolkien had created, and then building his own language from them. And so that's technically an a posteriori language, but not drawn from natural languages, drawing from the created work of somebody else. So it's like there's reasons for doing both. Something like Dothraki, like those people in that world has no connection to our own, so it'd be inappropriate to take anything from natural languages. So, yeah.
Very interesting. What languages, I guess created or natural, do you most enjoy?
All right. I mean, I have a very personal affinity with Irish. I'm an Irish speaker. Love Celtic mutations that you've been talking about. Haven't actually put them in a conlang yet. Definitely need to at some point. And I have a huge respect for a local Indigenous language here in Calgary, Blackfoot. I kind of got thrown into Blackfoot as a teaching assistant, not knowing anything about it. Got forced to learn it, and then it ended up being like half of my dissertation was on Blackfoot, and I'm still very connected to the community. And it's taught me a lot about what this human-centric idea of universal grammar is. It's not as it is universal, but what is universal isn't necessarily what we thought 10, 20, 30 years ago. There's a wide variety. And then, of course, in constructed languages, I'm big into the Klingon scene, so I have a lot of discourse with Klingon speakers, and I've actually done some linguistic experimentation on Klingon and produced some stuff with that. But I try not to let any of them influence my constructed languages too much. I want to make my own thing. So from the previous thing you were saying, I've never done an a posteriori language. I've always started from scratch.
What, if I can ask, what is your interest in Klingon specifically? Where does it stem from?
In, I think it was 1987, I got a VHS board game where a Klingon steals the Enterprise. And I think there were 3 or 4 words and maybe a sentence in Klingon in that board game. And that was the first time I realized, Klingon is a language. It's not just a bunch of grunts on the Next Generation. Maybe it was after that, because the Next Generation started in '87. But yeah, early '90s. Yeah. And I think 5-6 years ago, one of the people at the university here just passed me in the hall and said, "You're a Klingon speaker, right?" No. He's like, "But you're a Trekkie, huge Trekkie. Could you do a lecture on the linguistics of Klingon?" And I went on Amazon. The dictionary and grammar was 99 cents. I'm like, "Yep." And then I found out how wrong I was. The Klingon community quickly informed me of that and brought me in and helped me grow with that society.
I watched the first episode of The Next Generation when it aired. And thereafter, I watched the show. I kept watching the show. Never once had the question even entered my mind whether Klingon was a language or not. Never.
But Star Wars.
Never. So that one, it was like, and I don't know why it never went further than that. It just didn't, it wasn't like it didn't interest me. It neither interested nor didn't interest me. It didn't even register. Never. Yeah. Not even a blip.
Oh, with the board game, so there were
specific
of course.
Things. I'd never heard of this game. It sounds fun.
The Klingon would say, and I think it was the actor who played Gowron, but it wasn't the character Gowron. He would specifically say, "You, the one who is moving now, I'm going to call you Soil. Whenever I say Soil, you must stop and say yes, Commander." So you had to respond to Klingon names.
Okay.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
So this. Oh, I'm sorry. Now I'm back up. This is a VHS game.
VHS. We're talking like 91, 92.
Oh my God! Wow.
Hey, I remember watching the pilot, Mission to Farpoint, and my father asked me to record it, so I clicked record on the remote, still tethered to the Betamax.
Yeah. Oh my God.
This was September 27th, 1987.
Man, I've always been fascinated by those games. I used to have a VHS. We're getting a little far field here, but you'll have to excuse me. I had a game. I'm sorry, a VHS called How to Score More Points on Nintendo Games. And it was narrated by a gentleman called Skip Rogers, who referred to himself as World Video Game Champion. I never questioned that as a kid. This is on YouTube now, by the way. If you want to watch this, it's extraordinary. All right? And so, oh my God, the tips he gives you, it'll be like, press the A button to jump. And then, a minute later, and the rest is up to you. It's like, it tells you nothing. It tells you nothing. I mean, Simon's Quest is one of the games, and it's like, there is so much that just happens. It's like, there's no way to like, he just tells you things that it's like, there's no way to figure this out. Buy the blue crystal and kneel by the water, and it actually goes down and you can jump through, whereas ordinarily it kills you. But he doesn't actually mention that. Yeah. He'll just say, like, get the blue crystal, and then suddenly it's happening.
And you're done.
Yeah, anyway, so in the intro to this video, there were previews for other things. And one of them was a VHS game based on the works of Isaac Asimov, where you had to figure out who was actually a robot and who was a human, and it was a mystery game that evidently was okay for 6 or 8 year olds because they were in the commercial. But yeah, it begins, if you think I'm a robot in a man suit, and then he takes off his own head and it's a robot, you'd be mistaken. And then there's a man, he says, if you think I'm a man in a robot suit, and he does the same thing, he said, you are correct. Oh, anyway, but it was like, I wasn't a fancy rich person that could play a game on a VHS like that. I always wanted to play a game like that. Oh my goodness. Okay, what the hell are we talking about, Conley?
Favorite languages, right?
Oh, right, yeah. So,
well, okay, here's a different question. What's your natural languages? Which ones So you've answered this.
Yeah, no, I'll give you both. No, for natural languages, yeah, my favorite is Hawaiian, top number one, it always has been, I love it. Grammatically, Arabic blew me away, and I'm still in love with that language. It's amazing. But I mean, if I had to choose one, it would be Hawaiian, no doubt. For created languages, some of my favorites are Doug Ball's Scara, Sylvia Sotomayor's Anything. So like anything that she's doing is amazing. She's doing something right now that really is just mind-blowing. Then John Chiata's Ithkuil, very different type of language, but that's a really fun one. Early on, Mia Soderquist's Ea Luna really inspired me. That was just an absolutely gorgeous, beautiful language. So I have tons that are favorites. Those are some of the ones that are my favorite ones.
And I have to say, when I'm answering my favorite constructed language is Klingon, that's my connection to that language, not because it's a grammatical masterpiece or anything like that. You talk about Ithkuil or Itlani or Airi or any of those languages, like, oh my God, the work that Tony Harris or Jim Hopkins or any of them put into their languages, not comparable.
Out of the languages that you have created, what's that either people know or don't know about? What's the one thing that you've put into that language that you're kind of most proud of, or that you think people should know about because it is that good?
So one of the things that Blackfoot taught me about what is or isn't universal is there's what we call the tense phrase in syntax is where we get things like past tense or present tense in English. In Blackfoot, they don't deal with time, they deal with person. So the tense of a phrase is the person speaking it is also a participant in the phrase, not just in the speaking of the phrase, or not. Or the person being addressed is an actor in the conversation, or not. And so I learned you don't need to put tense or time into these grammatical relationships. And one of the languages I'm working on right now, rather than being anchored to time, is being anchored to participant orientation. So I say it's speaker oriented or it's not, it's addressee oriented or it's not. And what happens when you get, and this is nouny, but what happens when you get a pronoun that's singular and both addressee oriented and speaker oriented? Then you get a singular pronoun for you and I, the pair of us, but that's different from we being multiple people.
Yeah.
I love playing with stuff like that.
That's really cool. Sometimes it's hard to put a finger on, because I mean, there's always things that I enjoy. Like, what I always say, one of my favorite languages that I've created is Irathient, because it just does a lot of things that I really like. I really enjoy. It's got a noun class system, and I just think it's gangbusters. I'm a big fan of it. But some of the really impressive things that happen in a language are things that happen as a result of how this works. So like with Valyrian, with the tense system, so Valyrian doesn't have words like the or but I've noticed this, and it was more something I've noticed than I even intentionally created, but it's something that must exist as a matter of course, and I just already knew it, and I never wrote it down. But I'm working with, I created a Duolingo course for High Valyrian. And so then in translating stuff, you'd say you have some Valyrian sentence, doesn't matter what, you have to give every possible translation for this sentence that could be grammatically correct. So in that case, that could be the man sees the woman, it could be the man sees a woman, it could be a man sees the woman, a man sees a woman, and so on and so forth like that. But one of the things that I discovered is that how you translate it into English really depends on what the tense is. It depends crucially on what the tense is. And so it's like, a lot of times, like I would just give, I'm like, well, that's the best response, and people would say, well, couldn't you also translate that as like, he eats bread? And it's like, it's like, yeah, I can't say that's wrong, but also no. And it's like, and it's hard to explain because I haven't even taught you this other tense yet, you know. But and it's like, and it's also like, well, what about like, you know? So it's like he is eating the bread. It's like, well, kind of, but that's not the way I would do it, you know. But it's not because like, you know, there's such a word as the in there or anything like that. It's not even because of anything that's happening with the noun. It's because of other stuff that's happening, and that type of thing is really cool because it's something that emerges more or less naturally. It's something that you can plan out, but it's something that you feel when you're doing the translation, and it makes sense. And certainly, if you look at it as a linguist, you can analyze it and figure out exactly how these things are happening and why. These are discourse phenomena, but it's nothing that you can really point to super easily. It's kind of like the same way that in English, you know, you could say the difference between I'm going to the store on Wednesday versus I go to the store on Wednesday means slightly different things, and I go to the store on Wednesdays means totally different thing. But it's like, it's not as if plurality is the difference. Like,
yeah, okay.
You know, and it's just something you know. So that's the kind of cool stuff that it's really hard to point up in your language. It's actually easier for somebody else analyzing your language to show you.
So with your languages, I want to ask about swearing in your languages. Do you build that into a language just by default? Because but I also want to tie that into, is there the languages that you're creating, are there formal ways to talk and then more casual ways to talk, and do you build that into a language to begin with?
It's something that you need to consider. Certainly when I'm working on shows and stuff, they always want me to create swears because it seems to be the only thing they're interested in. You know, in addition to that, just when it comes to registers, it's something that should be in your mind. It's not something that, and especially when working on a show, it's not something that you get to demonstrate very easily. Often because, like, you know, the people speaking the language on this show, there's only 2 of them, and they're related, and they come from the exact same upbringing. They're about the same age, so it's like, well, their language patterns are not going to be super different. Every so often you get the chance. Like on Defiance, I got the chance to show, like, you know, how the adults who spoke these languages natively as their first languages, who came from these different alien planets, spoke differently from their children who were born on Earth and raised bilingually, you know. So you got to show that, but often, like, you just don't get the case, or you don't get the chance because there's just not an environment for it. I don't know.
Yeah, I used to put in a lot of rules for, like, in fast speech, or, you know, this would be the formal, you know, you would greet someone by saying "Pameti Chhopanyoin," which is it is honorable to know you, but, you know, most often you'll probably just hear "Akav," which was the short form. I don't do that so much anymore. I just I wait to see if I ever try to record something, what I'm going to do if I get fluent enough to speak it quickly, and see where I'll reduce it or see how I will change it. Swear words, I like doing a lot with curses, not just like the "hey, F you" kind of things that we think of as curse, but I did a race for an ancient human group, and their curse was "hold your palms." And the idea culturally was that you would wear your guilt on the palms of your hands, and they had this cultural belief that if you fumbled and dropped tools all the time, it was because you were guilty for something. So their curse became "hold your palms." So I do a lot of stuff like that,
cool.
and idiomatic expressions rather than "hey, F you."
For David, for yourself, look, what's kind of the most enjoyable part of the process for you? Is it the creation processes? Is it seeing what happens after you've done creating it? Is it where it goes afterwards?
There are parts that I enjoy for very different reasons. It's kind of like saying, like, yeah, do you like your favorite food for dinner more or your favorite dessert more? It's like, can I do both, please? You know? So it's like when I'm actually working out, you know, a series of morphological interrelationships between words, word systems, word paradigms. That's immensely satisfying to me. It's a lot of fun, especially when you start, you know, when you have the system and you start plugging in words to see how it works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you need more sound changes to get it right. But it's just, that's really enjoyable to see these tables get filled out. So that's one thing I enjoy in the creation process. I love creating words. I love just sitting down and creating words because, you know, they're miniature stories. You're creating, you know, the etymologies for the words, exactly how they came to mean what they mean, and that's really a lot of fun. And then just from an entirely different perspective, I love creating writing systems, very visual, and so that's the part of it, you know. And so they're both very intricate in terms of how they actually function, and then you're building the font, and that's an entirely separate set of skills. But you know, just you can look at cool stuff and design them, and then you can start typing stuff and see it. It's amazing. I love that.
We haven't even talked about the writing styles or the writing systems with it. That obviously has to come with.
Well, doesn't
the
language
language.
Not obviously.
No,
Not
Dothraki
obviously.
doesn't have a writing system.
No, because it's an oral language. And so the thing is, that if you look at the history of that world, were Dothraki to have a writing system, you know exactly how it would happen. That is, probably missionaries, probably from, like, you know, either the Faith of the Seven or over in Essos, the red people, you know, like the what is that called? The Lord of Light. That was it. They would probably go and try to convert the Dothraki, and probably not successfully for a lot of them, but what they would do is they would write up the first grammars. So the Dothraki have no written language, right? So those grammars would be written by somebody else, and they would be written in their writing system and in their language, and then when they actually transcribed that language, they would transcribe it using a variant of their own writing system. So that's what the writing system would end up being. It's kind of like, you know, pick a language, indigenous languages on this planet, whether it was written with either the Roman alphabet or with Cyrillic or with Arabic. Most of them are going to be written in one of those three. And so, you know, with some modifications to actually accommodate the fact that it's a different language. So that's what would happen. But then, you know, so there's that aspect to it, right? The historical aspect to it. And then there's just the pure designing the glyphs, see how they look, you know? Get something that looks cool, something that you really like, but also something that actually has systematicity to it, realism to it, and that you could imagine somebody sitting down and writing, you know?
So it's very much an art that is.
It certainly feels that
so.
way,
It's an art, but it has a lot of structure.
Well, sure. So is architecture.
Yeah.
I mean, lots of arts are that way. Lots of arts have some very technical aspects to them, and then of course there's also artists within those arts that don't really know much about it, the technical aspects, or they know it by feel, you know, and they just do it. Like there are plenty of songwriters who can talk your ear off about the circle of fifths and song structure and things like that. And then there are others that, you know, don't even know what notes are, but they know how to play a guitar, you know. And their stuff, you know, works. It's not like people hear their music and say, I can't even comprehend this, there's no structure to it. No, there's structure to it. It's just that they have an intuitive understanding of it, and they, you know, you ask them to actually give a lecture on music theory, they wouldn't know what to tell you.
Well, that made me think, what's the pop art of languages?
All right.
What's that?
No, there's, you know, when it comes to language creation, I say this often, we really just scratched the surface. Because when it comes to language creation as an art form, it's incredibly young. At least the way that I measure it. In order for something to actually be an art form, there has to be a community there. There has to be the potential for criticism, right? And there has to be, you know, kind of like goals, some sort of structure, and some sort of audience, really. And there wasn't that, like prior to, I mean, the earliest you'd want to say is maybe the 60s in this century, but certainly not like going back to the centuries before. So we're still feeling our way with it. And I'm like, but by the way, like you could say that totally isn't true of like visual art. Like the criticism of that goes back centuries. Probably not to the cave art days, you know, where somebody's like, huh, so that's what you did, huh? Water buffalo? Okay. But, you know what I'm saying? But it's like, you know, go back to the 12th century. And while like we're still like the fumbling around with language creation, visual art is already, you know, a thing.
Yeah.
There's already ways of talking about that. We're just getting to that right now. And so we're really just kind of moving into the phase of like, oh, not only are there different types of created languages, but there are different sets of aesthetic goals when it comes to language creation and different ways to evaluate languages based on those goals. We have not branched out very well into some of the more abstract forms of what language creation can be. I have ideas, but it's like nothing that's ever been tried in a systematic way before, as opposed to a haphazard way. We'll get there, but probably not soon. People are still going to want to kind of run the gamut of what we got going right now. We haven't run out of highway there, so to speak, but we'll get there one day.
Yeah, I mean, like you were referencing Sy earlier. Sy and Alex, who's a Calgarian, invented a gripping language. So it's not a sign language like you would make motions with your hands, but you could literally hand hold, and based on the position you have your fingers in, you could have a conversation with someone pretty discreetly.
Yeah.
I don't know how far that language went, but you know, exploring various other media of expression.
And also, I think that the place where we're going to see some really exciting things, very far into the future, probably not yet, is the relationship between form and meaning, which is not very, that space has not been explored fully. Right now, it's either very, you know, line it up one-to-one, very sensible, or very much like a natural language. But nobody's really exploring, well, what would it be like to have something that was really, really psychedelic in terms of the relationship between form and meaning? What would that look like?
I was thinking of John Chiata, but yeah, he hasn't gone the psychedelic route or anything like that.
What I was thinking of is Glide, which was a language created by somebody who actually does do psychedelics. But she presented it at the Third Language Creation Conference. And all Glide was 3 shapes and a program that moved the shapes with respect to one another in random ways.
Random ways.
Yeah. So it was like, and it was like, so there were 3 different possible shapes, and they could morph one shape into the other, and it was either like in the middle, above, or below. And they just kept melding. And so you just watch it. All right. So that's obviously an extraordinarily minimal example. But what if you had something where it was like, this word doesn't necessarily have a meaning unless it's used in relationship with other words. But even then, it doesn't necessarily mean anything on its own. It doesn't necessarily have a specific meaning. Even in these circumstances, it only has a range of meanings. And the goal is not necessarily communication, but artistic expression.
Okay.
You know, there's meat there. You know, there's work to be done, just not there yet.
As obviously a non-linguist, as far from it as you can get, when I watched the movie The Arrival, what the language system in that, what was your kind of thoughts on that?
I watched that on an airplane, and there was a part of that movie where I just started laughing uncontrollably at how charmingly quaint it was.
Now, they did actually pull the whiteboards out of Jessica's office, so there was some real linguistics kind of in the backgrounds of the scenes, but they just jumped.
This language is supposed to be a non-linear language, which they're like, oh, so it's written in a circle. There was that. And then there was this part, the part where I just started busting up and I couldn't stop was there's this crucial moment where it's like, oh, this is the drop dead moment. This is our last chance. Like, we can't just keep going on, you know, the aliens with the humans. We have to give them everything. And so they just started shooting out all these little ink circles. Meaning that
systems.
they were gonna like, because they were like, well, we need to give them the rest of the language. So here it is. Here are all the circles.
So I think that was supposed to be like Hedipod A and B. Like they had completely non-attached oral language versus written language.
Yeah, whatever garbage that was.
The big linguistic criticism was, you know, a field linguist wouldn't jump to written communication that fast. We'd stick it through for oral communication. And Jessica Kuhn was the linguist who consulted on that, and she said, you know, at a certain point you have to make concessions for, you know, Hollywood and stuff. She very much understood some of the craziness that was going on. But I will say we doubled our enrollment in first year linguistics after that movie came out, because everyone thought linguists were so cool.
Right on.
So with Game of Thrones, I have to ask these questions or else someone's going to beat me. Who have you enjoyed working with the most on it? Is it the actors? Is it David and David? Is it like what's?
Huh. Of the actors that have been on that show, and of the ones I've enjoyed working with, I would say Jason Momoa, but I never worked with him on that show. I worked with him on other stuff.
Yeah.
I helped him do accents, actually, for different roles in different movies. And you know, so I do stuff with him periodically here and there. And he's just a great big barrel of fun. What a joyous individual. You know who I imagine, like, what would be the ideal character for him, just playing himself? It would be the Ghost of Christmas Present. You know? Just somebody who's just like so happy to be in the moment and enjoys food and drink and a good laugh and a good song. All right.
Yeah.
In High Valyrian, Girimbose.
Oh.
Klingons don't say thank you. Saklanesh. They do have a word for it, but that's for those weak Federation people that need to express such pleasantries.
All right. So thank you very much, David. Joey, Joseph.
Who cares?
Joey, David, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about languages and linguistics and language creation. Thank you.
You ever watch The Simpsons?
Oh yeah.
You know about Joey, Joe, Shabadoo?
Joey, Joe, Junior, Shabadoo.
That was it.